The auctioneer laughed before he even finished reading the legal description. Not a polite laugh, not a professional chuckle he quickly swallowed. He laughed the way a man laughs when he is absolutely certain the room is with him. A slow, deliberate laugh that invited everyone standing in the cold November air of Holt County, Montana to join in. And they did. Every rancher, every banker's representative, every land speculator who had driven up from Billings with a briefcase and a hot thermos of coffee. They all laughed because the parcel on the auction block was Lot 7 of the Gallagher estate, and everyone in Holt County knew what Lot 7 was. Let us know in the comments from which part of the world you are watching this video. If you're enjoying our videos, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. 5 acres of frozen rock on the north shoulder of Ember Ridge, sitting at 4,000 feet elevation where the wind came off the Beartooth Range like a blade. The soil, if you could call it soil, was a mix of shattered shale and ice-locked clay that had never in living memory produced a single row of crops. The only structure on the land was a collapsed stone barn whose roof had caved under a 1962 snowfall and never been repaired. Half the parcel was vertical. The other half was nearly vertical. The creek that ran along its eastern boundary froze solid by October and didn't thaw until late April or sometimes May. The previous owner, old Cormac Gallagher, had acquired it in 1951 as part of a larger land package and had spent 30 years trying to figure out what to do with it. He never did. When he died, his children divided the estate quickly and cleanly. The bottomland went to the eldest, the timber acres to the second, the grazing pasture to the youngest. Lot 7, the frozen rock, went to no one. It sat in the estate like an unpaid bill until the county court ordered it auctioned to settle a tax debt of $1,440. My name is Clara Drennan, nee Sobek. I was 31 years old that November morning. My husband, Thomas Drennan, was 34. We had $3,200 in a savings account that represented 4 years of careful, grinding sacrifice. 2 people working 2 jobs each, eating nothing that wasn't bought on sale, driving a truck with a cracked windshield because replacing it felt like a luxury we couldn't justify. We had driven 90 miles from our apartment in Laurel that morning in that truck, with the heater on one side of the cab not working and a road atlas spread open on my lap because we couldn't afford the gas to take a wrong turn. People asked us later, after everything, why we bid on Lot 7. They asked it the way people ask questions to which they assume the answer is stupidity or desperation. We must not have known what we were getting. We must have been confused by the legal description. We must have thought it was a different parcel. None of that was true. We bid on Lot 7 because Thomas had been reading about it for 6 months. My husband was not a farmer. He was not a geologist. He had grown up in a small house in Roundup, Montana, the son of a mechanic and a school cook, and he had 1 year of community college before money ran out and he went to work at an equipment rental yard. He was the kind of man who read everything. Not because anyone had told him to, but because he was constitutionally incapable of leaving a question unanswered. He had started reading about Ember Ridge the previous spring when we'd driven through Holt County on our way back from visiting his mother. We'd passed the north shoulder of the ridge, the frozen rock part, Lot 7, and Thomas had slowed the truck almost to a stop. "There's something wrong with that hillside," he said. I looked. I saw what everyone else saw. Broken shale, sparse, wind-twisted pines, gray rock face, ice in the shadows even in May. "Wrong how?" I asked. "The color," he said. "Up there, near the top. Look at the rock face. It's darker on the left side than the right side, almost wet-looking. And it's May." I told him it was probably just the shadow from the tree line. He didn't say anything. But when we got home, he started reading. He read about the geology of the Beartooth Front, the ancient rock formations that formed the eastern face of that range, how glacial activity had shaped and reshaped the terrain over 10,000 years. He read about aquifer systems in high-elevation terrain, how meltwater from mountain snowpack didn't always flow to the surface the way you'd expect, how sometimes it moved laterally through fractured rock, accumulating under pressure in natural underground cisterns before finding release through springs or seeps. He read about a specific geological feature called a contact spring, a place where two different types of rock meet, forcing groundwater that has been moving horizontally through permeable strata to rise and discharge at the surface. And in a 1958 survey report from the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology, a document he ordered by mail from the state library and waited 3 weeks to receive, he found a single paragraph that made him sit very still at our kitchen table for a long time. The northern shoulder of Ember Ridge, the report noted, exhibited characteristics consistent with a substantial subterranean water accumulation. Preliminary observations in 1956 suggested a high-volume contact spring discharge point somewhere along the upper north face. The area was considered commercially non-viable due to terrain and access challenges, and no further investigation was conducted. A high-volume contact spring on the frozen rock nobody wanted. That was why we drove 90 miles with a broken heater and a cracked windshield. That was why we bid. We bought Lot 7 for $2,400. The auctioneer, to his credit, looked genuinely sorry for us. A man from the bank named Wickfield shook his head as he walked to his car and said, loud enough for us to hear, that some people's money was wasted before they even had a chance to spend it right. Thomas smiled the whole drive home. We did not have enough money left to do anything dramatic. After the purchase price, the filing fees, and the fuel for 3 trips out to the land in December to assess what we'd actually bought, we had $440 in the bank and a piece of frozen rock that no one in Holt County believed we would ever get $1 of value from. Our families were not unkind about it. They were worse than unkind. They were patient. My mother called on a Sunday and asked how the land was going in the careful, neutral tone she used when she already knew the answer and was giving me space to arrive at it myself. Thomas's brother Calvin invited us for Christmas dinner and, after the meal, walked Thomas out to the porch and asked him, brother to brother, whether we'd considered just letting the county have it back for the tax debt and cutting our losses while we still had some savings left. Thomas listened to all of it. He nodded in the right places, and then he kept reading. That first winter, while the land sat buried under 3 feet of snow, Thomas was building a map, not a purchased map, a hand-drawn one, constructed from the 1958 survey report, 2 USGS topographic sheets he ordered for $4 each, and a series of aerial photographs he got from the county assessor's office. He spread them all across our kitchen table and cross-referenced them every evening after his shift at the equipment yard. I helped when I could. I was working the breakfast shift at a diner in Laurel 6 days a week, and some evenings I was so tired that thinking required effort. But Thomas had a way of explaining things that made the complexity disappear. He'd sit beside me and trace lines on the topo sheets with his finger and say, "See how the elevation contours bunch up tight here, then open out? That means a bench, a flat shelf cut into the hillside. That's where the rock strata change. That's the contact zone." I'd look at the map and gradually I'd see what he saw. Not just lines, but a story. The ridge wasn't just rock and ice, it was a machine, a slow, million-year-old machine for collecting water and moving it through stone. By March, Thomas believed he had identified the likely discharge zone for the contact spring, a shallow bowl near the upper northeast corner of our 5 acres, where the shale gave way to a band of older, denser granite. The 1958 survey had noted the area but never measured it. No one had been up there with instruments since. We drove out in late March, when the snow was still knee-deep in the hollows, but the road to the base of the ridge had cleared enough for our truck. We hiked up with a compass, Thomas's hand-drawn map, and 2 pairs of borrowed snowshoes. I want to be precise about this moment because people who hear the story afterward always expect it to be cinematic. A crack in the rock, a rush of water, something sudden and dramatic. It wasn't like that. What we found in that shallow bowl on the upper northeast face of our 5 acres was a patch of ground approximately 20 feet across where the snow had melted, completely melted, down to bare earth, while everything around it was still buried under 2 feet of white. In late March, at 4,000 feet, in Holt County, Montana. A circle of warm, bare ground fringed by a patchy green moss that had no business being green in late winter. Thomas knelt at the edge of that circle and pressed his palm flat against the bare soil. He looked up at me. "It's warm," he said. "The ground is warm." Below us, somewhere in the stone, water was moving. And moving water carries heat. The spring hadn't just existed, it had been warm enough all winter to melt the snow from above. We stood there in the silence of the Beartooth Front, 2 people with $440 in the bank and a 5-acre joke, and I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt certain. I want to be careful here, because there is a version of this story where the spring simply appeared and everything became easy. That version is a lie. The work was brutal, slow, and expensive in ways we could barely afford. April came and the snow began pulling back from the ridge. We were up there every weekend and Thomas took 2 unpaid days each week to work the land while I covered our fixed expenses with diner wages. We were not eating well. We were not sleeping enough. There was a period in May where the strain of it, the money fear, the physical exhaustion, the weight of what we'd bet on, made Thomas and I say things to each other across the kitchen table that we later had to unsaid carefully, one word at a time. We fought. I won't pretend we didn't. I sat in the truck one Saturday morning parked at the base of the ridge and told Thomas I wasn't sure I could keep doing this. That I was tired of the diner, tired of the cold, tired of explaining to my mother why we hadn't cut our losses yet. Thomas sat with that for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "I'm not asking you to believe in the spring. I'm asking you to believe in me long enough to find out if I'm right." That was enough. I got out of the truck. The spring itself wasn't hidden dramatically. It wasn't sealed behind a rockfall the way stories like to tell it. It was buried under 40 years of sediment accumulation, gravel, clay, organic debris that had washed down from above and gradually choked the natural discharge point until only a faint seep remained. What should have been a flowing spring had been reduced to an underground trickle that only made itself known by warming the ground above it and keeping a small circle of snow clear all winter. We cleared it by hand, the 2 of us, across 6 weekends in May and June. We moved hundreds of pounds of rock and clay with shovels and a borrowed hand tamper and a wheelbarrow that kept losing a wheel bolt. We laid perforated drainage tile along the base of the excavation to prevent the sediment from washing back. Thomas rigged a stone spillway to direct the water once it flowed freely. On the 4th Saturday of June, at approximately 2 in the afternoon, with both of us muddy to the elbows and my back sending signals I chose to ignore, Thomas's shovel blade hit the clay cap over the spring discharge and the ground shuddered. Then the water came. It didn't explode. It didn't roar. It welled up. Quietly, steadily, cold and absolutely clear, rising to fill the excavation basin in a matter of minutes and then spilling over Thomas's stone edge in a thin, glittering curtain. We both stood very still. I tasted it. It was so cold it was almost painful. And it had a clean mineral quality that tasted of depth, of stone, of somewhere very old. Thomas looked at me and his face was doing something complicated. Relief and vindication, and something that looked like grief, though I didn't understand the grief part until later. "I was right," he said. Not triumphantly, quietly, the way a person says something they've needed to say for a very long time. "You were right," I said. We drove home that evening and I called my mother and told her. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Well, a spring is a nice thing to have." She had no idea yet what it meant. A spring on 5 acres of frozen rock might have remained what my mother called it, a nice thing to have, a curiosity, a pleasant source of cold, clean water for 2 people who'd earned it the hard way. What changed everything was the flow rate. 3 weeks after we opened the spring, Thomas drove out alone on a weekday with a 5-gallon bucket and a stopwatch. He timed how long it took the bucket to fill from the spillway. He repeated it 12 times at different times of day. He came home that evening and did math on a legal pad for an hour. Then he called me over to the table. "Slow and steady," he said. "This spring is producing between 60 and 80 gallons per minute." He let that sit. I did the math myself. 60 gallons per minute is nearly 90,000 gallons a day. "That's not a backyard spring," I said. "No," Thomas said. "That's a municipal water source, a high-volume contact spring. Just like the 1958 survey had suggested. Just like the wet, dark rock face Thomas had spotted from the truck window 3 years earlier. We needed help understanding what we had." Thomas called the county extension office, who referred us to a hydrologist at Montana State named Dr. Priya Nair. She drove up from Bozeman on a Saturday in August to look at the spring. She brought instruments and spent 4 hours on our 5 acres, measuring flow rates, testing water quality, mapping the approximate drainage basin above us on the ridge. She sat with us on the tailgate of our truck afterward and read from her clipboard. "The water is excellent quality," she said. "Better than excellent. No agricultural contamination. Your elevation is above the grazing zones. Low mineral content except for beneficial calcium and magnesium from the limestone band above the granite contact. The flow rate is consistent and shows no significant variation between morning and afternoon readings, which suggests the source aquifer is very large." She looked up. "You know what sits above you on the ridge?" she asked. "Snowpack," Thomas said. 800 acres of snowpack," Dr. Nair said. "Fed by the Beartooth Front. Your spring is the primary surface discharge point for an aquifer that's been collecting that melt for," her voice shifted, "probably several thousand years. There is an enormous amount of water sitting in the fractured granite above you. What you've opened is one release valve. A small one." She paused. "Do you know what Holt County's municipal water system looks like?" she asked. We knew. Everyone in the county knew. The town of Dreyer, the county seat, 1,200 people, drew from Flat Creek Reservoir, a surface water source that had been problematic since the late 1970s. Seasonal fluctuation, agricultural runoff. The water treatment plant was aging. The county had been studying alternatives for years and finding none affordable. Dr. Nair didn't say the obvious thing. She looked at the spring, then at us, then back at her clipboard. "I think you should talk to someone in the county," she said carefully, "before the word gets out on its own." The Holt County Commission met on the first and third Tuesday of every month in a low brick building in Dreyer that smelled of old carpet and fluorescent lights. We requested 5 minutes on the agenda for the October 3rd meeting. They gave us 5 minutes because Thomas had phrased the request carefully. A presentation on a potential alternative water source for the Dreyer municipal system. The commission secretary had called us back to confirm it was about water and not about a rezoning request or a livestock dispute, the 2 most common reasons civilians showed up at commission meetings. We walked in with Thomas's flow rate data, Dr. Nair's preliminary assessment, the 1958 survey report, and photographs of the spring. There were 3 commissioners: Chairman Dale Ferris, a cattle rancher with 30 years in county politics; Commissioner Judith Holst, who ran the farm supply co-op in town; and Commissioner Art Wenner, who was the closest thing Holt County had to a progressive voice. He'd once suggested the county look into wind energy and been laughed out of the same room we were standing in. Ferris looked at us the way he looked at everything, with a careful blankness that gave away nothing while he decided whether you were worth his attention. Thomas presented. 12 minutes, not 5. No one interrupted him. He laid out the geology, the flow rate, the water quality results, the drainage basin calculations. He explained what a contact spring was, what the 1958 survey had found and failed to follow up on, why the spring had been choked and what we'd done to open it. He put Dr. Nair's assessment on the table in front of the commissioners. When he finished, Ferris looked at the papers for a long time. Then he looked at Judith Holst. Then he looked at Art Wenner, who was already sitting forward with his elbows on the table. "Where exactly is this property?" Ferris asked. "North shoulder of Ember Ridge," Thomas said. "Lot 7, Gallagher Estate. We purchased it at the county tax auction in November of last year." Ferris knew the parcel. You could see it in the slight shift of his expression. Recognition, then something else. Something recalibrating. "How much are you asking for the water rights?" he asked. Thomas had prepared for this question. He'd stayed up 3 nights preparing for it. His answer was not what I think any of them expected. "We're not asking to sell them," Thomas said. "We're proposing a partnership, a 50-year water service agreement. The county builds the infrastructure, the pipeline, the treatment facility, whatever's needed. We provide the water. The rate is fixed at cost of delivery, not market rate, and the agreement includes a provision that water access cannot be denied to any county resident based on inability to pay." The room was quiet. Wenner broke it first. He asked Thomas to repeat the last part. Thomas repeated it. "Water access cannot be denied to any county resident based on inability to pay." Ferris picked up Dr. Nair's assessment and read it again. He set it down. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "I'll be honest with you," he said. "I was at that auction last November. I watched you buy this lot." He stopped. "I owe you an apology before we go any further." Thomas shook his head. "We just want to talk about water," he said. "The county commission voted to commission a full hydrological study in November. The study would take 8 months. The pipeline proposal would go to public vote the following year." Everything was moving, slowly, carefully, in the methodical pace of county government. Then the drought came. It started the following July, sudden and severe. Montana's high country had seen dry summers before, but this one was different. A high-pressure system parked over the Rockies for 8 weeks, baking the landscape, pulling moisture out of every shallow reservoir and surface creek in the region. Flat Creek dropped first. By mid-July, the reservoir that supplied Dreyer's water system was at 31% capacity. By August 1st, it was at 19%. The county issued mandatory restrictions. No outdoor watering, no car washing, 2-minute showers, every non-essential use suspended. Agricultural wells across the county began failing. Not all of them, but enough. The shallow ones, the ones that had always been reliable because the water table in this valley stayed steady. Except now it wasn't steady. The combination of drought and high demand was pulling the water table down faster than it could recover. Farmers who had watered their stock from the same wells their parents had dug were watching the water drop. We had been ready for none of this. Our spring was flowing, steadily, completely unaffected, at 4,000 feet, insulated by granite, fed by an aquifer that operated on geological time and didn't notice an 8-week drought the way a surface reservoir did. 62 gallons per minute. Day after day, through the driest August in 40 years. But we had no infrastructure, no pipeline, no storage, nothing but a stone basin on 5 acres of ridgeline and a gravel track that needed a 4-wheel drive to navigate. The first people arrived on a Wednesday. Let us know in the comments from which part of the world you are watching this video. If you're enjoying our videos, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. A family named Prout, dairy operation 6 miles east of Dreyer, pulled up at the base of our ridge at 6 in the morning with a tank truck they used for liquid fertilizer, hastily emptied and rinsed. The father, a man named Gerald, climbed out and stood in our driveway and told us his stock wells had gone to mud. He had 94 dairy cows. I want you to know that I didn't hesitate. I thought about it afterward, whether I should have called a lawyer first, established protocols, protected our interests. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I told Gerald Prout to drive his tank truck up the ridge. He filled it that morning and came back that afternoon. The next day he brought his neighbor's truck too. By the end of the week, there were vehicles at the base of our ridge every morning at first light. Tank trucks, plastic tote containers in truck beds, 5-gallon jugs in family cars. Thomas got up at 4 every morning and was at the spring by 5 to manage flow and make sure nobody clogged the discharge point. I drove into Dreyer for supplies and hardware and came back to find him soaked, exhausted, and unwilling to leave. We never charged a single person. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I don't want it to sound like virtue for its own sake. The truth is more practical than that. We believed in what this water could mean for the county. We had presented it to the commission as a public resource managed at cost. Charging for it in the drought, when people were desperate and we had the leverage to name any price, would have made us exactly the kind of people we had been careful not to be. And there was something else. Every one of those people who drove up our ridge road had driven past Lot 7 their whole lives. Every rancher who filled his tank from our spring had probably laughed at the auction or heard about it and laughed anyway. We were the couple who'd bought the frozen rock, the fools from Laurel who'd spent their savings on 5 acres of shale. And now they needed us. Not to rub it in, not to collect the debt, just they needed us. And we had what they needed. That was enough. The drought lasted 10 weeks. When the rains finally returned in September, Flat Creek Reservoir climbed back to a workable level. The immediate crisis passed, but the county had learned something it couldn't unlearn. Flat Creek was one bad summer away from failure, always had been. The Dreyer water system was fragile, surface-dependent, and aging. They had known this for years in an abstract, someday we'll deal with it way. The drought had made it immediate. The hydrological study, which had been proceeding at county government pace, was suddenly the most urgent document in Holt County. The commission authorized additional funding to accelerate it. Dr. Neyer's team was on our ridge twice a week through September and October. They drilled test bores above the spring to map the aquifer's extent. They installed monitoring equipment at the discharge point to track flow rates through seasonal variation. The results, released in a formal report in November, exactly 2 years after we'd stood at that auction in the cold, were more significant than even Thomas had projected. The aquifer beneath Ember Ridge's north shoulder contained an estimated recoverable freshwater reserve sufficient to supply Dreyer's current municipal needs for a minimum of 200 years at present consumption rates. The spring discharge, properly developed with a collection system, could deliver consistent high-quality water year-round regardless of surface drought conditions. The water quality exceeded EPA standards for direct municipal use with only minimal treatment. Dr. Neyer presented the report to the county commission on a Tuesday evening. The room was full. Not just commissioners, but ranchers, business owners, the school board chairman, the county hospital director, people who had never attended a commission meeting in their lives. Thomas sat beside me in the second row and didn't say anything for a long time. When Dr. Neyer finished, he leaned over and said quietly, 1958. They knew in 1958. 66 years ago. And nobody came back. Nobody came back, I agreed, because it was frozen rock on a vertical hillside with no road access and nobody could see how to make money from it, he said. Not because the water wasn't there, because they couldn't see past the surface. The Holt County Water Infrastructure Bond passed in March with 73% approval, the highest margin for any county ballot measure in 30 years. The bond funded construction of a pipeline from our spring to a new water treatment facility at the edge of Dreyer, a covered reservoir for storage and pressure management, and the road improvements necessary to access and maintain the system. Construction began in June and took 14 months. Thomas and I were on the ridge almost every day of those 14 months. Not because we needed to supervise the engineers and construction crews. They were professional and didn't need us underfoot. We were there because it was ours and we had earned the right to watch it become what it was meant to be. There was a man on the construction crew named Roy Hapstead, a pipe layer from up near Hardin, who arrived his first week on the job and spent 3 days looking at our 5 acres with an expression I recognized. The expression of someone trying to reconcile what they'd heard about a place with what they were actually seeing. On his 4th day, he caught me alone near the spring basin and said, "I heard about this place a year ago. Heard it was 5 acres of nothing that some couple from Laurel paid too much for." I smiled. "That's one version of the story," I said. "What's the other version?" he asked. I looked at the spring, running clear and steady, the way it had been running for thousands of years before we found it and the way it would run for thousands of years after we were gone. "The other version," I said, "is that this was never nothing. It was just waiting." Harlan, our old friend Roy, thought about that for a moment and then nodded and went back to work. The water service agreement was signed in August of the construction year. 50 years, fixed rate at cost of delivery, water access guaranteed to all county residents regardless of ability to pay. The county's legal team had tried, gently, to push back on that last provision. It created administrative complexity, they said. It was non-standard, it could be a liability. Thomas wouldn't move on it. "Either that provision is in the agreement," he said, "or there is no agreement." It was in the agreement. The Dreer water system went live on a Saturday in August, 2 years and 9 months after we'd stood at that auction in the cold with our cracked windshield truck and our $3,000 and our belief in something nobody else could see. The town held a ceremony. The mayor said things. The commission chairman said things. Dr. Neer said things that were actually interesting about geology and aquifer science and the importance of the 1958 survey report that had been sitting unread in a state library for 66 years. Then they asked Thomas to speak. He stood at the podium for a moment and looked at the crowd. Ranchers, shopkeepers, families, the same faces that had been at that auction, or whose cousins had been, or whose fathers had. Holt County was small enough that everyone had been everywhere twice. He said this, "I want to talk about what this spring is not. It is not a smart investment. It is not a brilliant scheme. It is not the result of special knowledge or connections or luck. Clara and I found this spring because we refuse to accept that the surface of a thing tells you everything about it. 5 acres of frozen rock looked like worthless land to everyone who'd ever driven past it. And they were right. The surface was worthless. The surface was exactly as bad as it looked, but the surface is never the whole story. It never is. Not for land, not for people, not for anything. My one request for this county going forward is this: be curious about the things that look worthless. Slow down when something seems like a punchline. The surface tells you almost nothing. The water is almost always deeper than you think." The crowd was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet at all. Chairman Ferris shook Thomas's hand and held it for a beat longer than a handshake needed and said, "I've lived here 60 years and I drove past that lot 1,000 times. He stopped. "I should have been curious." Thomas shook his head. "You drove past it the same way everyone drives past things that look like nothing," he said. "We just happened to stop." The agreement brought the county something more than water. It brought certainty, the kind that lets communities plan, invest, grow without the background fear of a failing reservoir. 3 years after the water system went live, a medical clinic opened in Dreer, the first the county had had in 11 years. The developer cited reliable water infrastructure as a key factor. A food processing cooperative opened the following year, employing 47 people. A school renovation project, long delayed because of concerns about the district's long-term viability, was approved. None of these things happened because of our spring alone. But the spring was the foundation, the certainty underneath. We moved permanently to the ridge in the 3rd year. Thomas designed a house himself, modest, stone-built, oriented to face south and catch the winter light. We built it over 2 summers with help from neighbors who had once driven tank trucks up our road during the drought, and who came back now with tools instead of containers, which felt like the right direction of exchange. Wickfield, the bankman who'd shaken his head at the auction, he stopped me in the hardware store in Dreer one winter afternoon. He stood there in his good coat holding a box of light bulbs, and he said, "You know, I want to say something to you." "Go ahead," I said. "I've been wrong about things before," he said. "I've been a fool about things before. But I don't think I've ever been as wrong, as specifically wrong, in a way that mattered as much as I was about that lot." He paused. "I said things at that auction, about your money being wasted. I said it loud enough that you heard it." "I remember," I said. "I'm sorry for that." I looked at him for a moment. He was a man who had probably never apologized for anything in a hardware store before. Probably not anywhere. "We all see the surface first," I said. "That's not a sin. It's just the starting point." He nodded. Then he said, "What made you look deeper?" "Thomas," I said. "Thomas made me look deeper." But that wasn't entirely true. I had looked at the same rock face from the truck window that Thomas had. I had seen what everyone saw. What Thomas had was not better eyes, exactly. It was the refusal to let the surface be the final answer, the habit of asking one more question, the stubbornness that most people call foolishness right up until the moment they call it wisdom. Gerald Prout, the dairy farmer who'd been first up our road with his fertilizer tank, became one of our closest friends in those years. He brought his oldest son to meet us one summer afternoon, a boy of about 14, the age when young people are deciding what kind of person they're going to be. Gerald sat the boy down on the porch near the spring and told him the whole story. The auction, the frozen rock, the drought, the tank trucks, the pipeline. The boy listened with the careful attention of someone who understands that an adult is trying to teach him something important. When Gerald finished, the boy looked at Thomas and asked, "How did you know to look for the spring in the first place?" Thomas thought about it for a moment. "I didn't know," he said. "I just noticed something that didn't look right. The rock face was darker on one side than the other. That was it. One thing that didn't fit the pattern I expected. And instead of deciding my eyes were wrong, I decided to find out why." The boy sat with that. Then he said, "That seems like a small thing." Thomas smiled. "Most large things start as small ones," he said. "I am writing this 22 years after the auction. The spring is still flowing. It has never stopped, not in drought or hard freeze, not in the wettest years or the driest. The Dreer water system serves 1,400 people now. The town has grown since the infrastructure came in. The fixed-rate agreement has kept water bills among the lowest in the state. The provision for residents who can't pay has been used quietly and without drama every year. We have grandchildren who play on this ridge, in the thin alpine meadow below the spring basin where we planted grasses and wildflowers in the 3rd year. They do not know what frozen rock looks like from the outside. To them it has always been home. The stone house, the spring, the view west toward the Beartooth front that never gets old. Thomas reads more than ever. His subjects have shifted over the years, from geology to hydrology to the history of water law in the American West to, lately, the physics of glacial retreat and what it means for high-altitude aquifer recharge over the next century. He is 60 years old and he is not done learning things. He is constitutionally incapable of leaving a question unanswered. This has not changed. I still think about that auction morning sometimes. The auctioneer's laugh, the bankman's voice, loud enough for us to hear. The drive home in the truck with the broken heater, Thomas smiling, me less certain but unwilling to say so. What I've learned in 22 years on this ridge is that the laughter was never really about us or about the land. The laughter was about the limits of what people allow themselves to see. Frozen rock looks like frozen rock. A vertical hillside looks like a vertical hillside. A couple with a cracked windshield and $400 after the sale looks like people who have made a bad decision. The laughter is always about the surface. The surface tells you almost nothing. What our 5 acres taught me, what the spring has been saying every minute of every day for 22 years in its quiet, steady, unhurried way, is this: the things that look worthless are almost never worthless. They are hard to reach, badly presented, inconveniently located, poorly understood, or simply unseen. There is a difference between worthless and unseen, an enormous difference. The gap between those two things is where every important discovery lives. The people who succeed at finding it are not smarter than the people who don't. They are not luckier or better connected or born into the right family. They are, mostly, just the people who refuse to let the surface be the final answer, who slowed the truck down when something didn't quite look right, who drove 90 miles with a broken heater because a single paragraph in a 60-year-old survey report said there might be water in the rock. There is water in the rock. There has always been water in the rock. It is waiting for the person stubborn enough, curious enough, and patient enough to stop driving past and start asking why. Your 5 acres of frozen rock are not a waste. They are not a mistake. They are not a punchline. They are the beginning of a question that nobody has been stubborn enough to finish asking yet. Slow down when something doesn't look right. Ask one more question. Dig deeper. The county is downstream from you, the whole county, and what you find in the rock will feed it. Let us know in the comments from which part of the world you are watching this video. If you're enjoying our videos, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The surface tells you almost nothing. The water is always deeper than it looks. Carved in granite. Drennan Spring Basin, Ember Ridge, Holt County, Montana.